In the autumn of 1845, fields across Ireland darkened with a sickness few had ever seen. Within months, a staple that sustained millions dissolved into rot beneath the soil. By the time the crisis had run its course, roughly 1 million people were dead, and another million had left their homeland. Villages emptied, ships departed crowded harbors for distant continents, and an island that had once been densely populated entered a long demographic decline. What began as a crop failure became one of the most devastating social catastrophes in modern European history. In the early 19th century, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Its population had grown rapidly, rising from around 4 million in 1780 to over 8 million by 1841. This growth rested on fragile foundations. Much of rural Ireland was structured around small tenant farms. Land was concentrated in the hands of landlords, many of them absentee proprietors living in Britain. Tenants rented small plots, often subdivided among sons with each generation. For millions, survival depended on a single crop, the potato. The potato had transformed Irish rural life since its widespread adoption in the 18th century. It thrived in poor soils and damp climates, producing high caloric yields on small plots. A family could subsist on potatoes and a small quantity of milk. While grains, livestock, and other agricultural goods were produced in Ireland, these were often destined for export, forming part of a commercial system that linked Irish estates to British markets. The rural poor relied overwhelmingly on the potato for daily sustenance. In 1845, reports began to circulate of a strange blight affecting potato crops in parts of continental Europe. By late summer, the disease appeared in Ireland. The culprit was Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that spread rapidly in cool, damp conditions. Infected plants blackened, and tubers stored underground turned soft and inedible. Contemporary observers described fields that looked healthy one week and were ruined the next. That year, perhaps a third of the crop failed. Many believed the damage would be temporary. The following year removed any illusion of a short-term crisis. In 1846, the blight returned with greater severity. Crop failure was widespread and catastrophic. The potato harvest largely collapsed. For millions who depended on it, there was no alternative food source readily available. Grain and livestock continued to be produced and exported, but these commodities were not accessible to the poorest tenants who lacked purchasing power. The British government in London faced mounting pressure to respond. In 1845, Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel authorized limited relief measures. He secretly purchased Indian corn from the United States to sell at cost in Ireland and established public works schemes to provide wages. However, Peel's government fell in 1846, and a new administration under Lord John Russell adopted a more laissez-faire approach. Influenced by prevailing economic doctrines that emphasized minimal state intervention and reliance on market forces, officials sought to limit direct relief and instead expanded public works programs. Under these programs, hundreds of thousands of men labored on road building and drainage projects in exchange for wages. The scale of need quickly overwhelmed administrative capacity. Wages were often insufficient to meet rising food prices. Many workers were physically weakened, reducing their ability to perform heavy labor. By early 1847, the public works system was deemed unsustainable and replaced by a new approach centered on soup kitchens under the Temporary Relief Act. For a brief period, these kitchens provided daily meals to millions, offering some stabilization during what became known as Black 47, the worst year of the famine. Simultaneously, the poor law system, originally designed to provide limited relief through workhouses, came under extreme strain. Workhouses were intended to house the destitute, funded by local taxation. As starvation and disease spread, admissions surged far beyond capacity. New workhouses were constructed, but overcrowding remained severe. Infectious diseases such as typhus, relapsing fever, and cholera flourished in conditions of malnutrition and congestion. Mortality rates rose sharply, not solely from hunger but from disease exacerbated by weakened immune systems and poor living conditions. Land tenure arrangements compounded the crisis. Many landlords, faced with tenants unable to pay rent, initiated evictions. In some cases, landlords sought to consolidate holdings by clearing small tenants and converting land to pasture, which required fewer laborers. Evictions displaced families who then sought entry into workhouses or joined the growing stream of emigrants. Some landlords assisted emigration financially, paying for passages abroad as a means of reducing local poverty burdens. Others offered little support. The diversity of landlord responses reflected varied financial situations and personal inclinations, but the cumulative effect was widespread displacement. Emigration, already a feature of Irish life before 1845, accelerated dramatically during the famine years. Between 1845 and 1855, approximately 2 million people left Ireland. Many traveled to Britain, but a significant number embarked for North America. Ships departing from ports such as Cork and Liverpool carried thousands seeking relief from famine conditions. Conditions aboard some vessels were harsh, particularly in 1847, when overcrowding and disease were common. Mortality rates on certain transatlantic voyages were high, leading to the later label of coffin ships, though the term was not universally applied at the time. In Canada, particularly at Grosse Isle and the St. Lawrence River, quarantine stations struggled to process the influx of sick passengers. In the United States, cities such as New York and Boston saw large arrivals of Irish migrants. These newcomers often faced poverty and discrimination but formed enduring communities that reshaped urban demographics. Remittances sent back to Ireland in subsequent decades would become an important support for relatives who remained. By 1848 and 1849, the blight persisted, though harvests were somewhat less disastrous than in 1846. Relief efforts continued, but fatigue and financial constraints influenced policy. The Encumbered Estates Act of 1849 facilitated the sale of indebted estates, accelerating changes in land ownership. Over time, consolidation and shifts toward pasture altered rural economic structures. Smallholder reliance on potatoes diminished as population levels fell and agricultural practices changed. Estimating mortality during the famine is complex. Census data from 1851 indicated a population decline of over 2 million since 1841. Scholars generally estimate that approximately 1 million people died from starvation or famine-related diseases between 1845 and 1852. The precise number cannot be known with certainty due to incomplete records and the difficulty of distinguishing causes of death. Nevertheless, the scale of demographic loss is clear. The famine's impact extended beyond immediate mortality. Ireland's population, which had peaked in the early 1840s, entered a prolonged decline. Emigration continued for decades after the worst years had passed. By 1901, the population stood at around 4.5 million, nearly half the pre-famine level. Entire regions, particularly in the west and south, experienced lasting depopulation. Abandoned cottages and altered settlement patterns testify to the transformation. Politically, the famine deepened tensions between Ireland and Britain. Criticism of British policy emerged both during and after the crisis. Some contemporaries argued that relief was insufficient and overly constrained by ideological commitments to market principles. Others contended that the British government had provided substantial aid within fiscal and political limits. Historical debate continues over the adequacy and intent of official responses. While there is broad agreement that policy failures exacerbated suffering, scholars differ in their interpretation of responsibility and structural constraints. Irish nationalist movements drew upon famine memory in subsequent decades. The catastrophe became a reference point in arguments for land reform and political autonomy. Organizations advocating tenant rights and later home rule cited the structural inequities of the pre-famine system. In the late 19th century, land reforms gradually expanded tenant rights and facilitated peasant proprietorship, altering the agrarian landscape that had prevailed before 1845. Culturally, the famine left an enduring imprint on Irish identity and diaspora communities. Songs, oral histories, and later literature preserved accounts of loss and migration. In the 20th century, historians and public memorials revisited the famine as a formative national trauma. Commemorations in Ireland, Britain, Canada, and the United States reflect the global dispersion that began in the late 1840s. The environmental dimension of the famine also warrants consideration. The reliance on a limited number of potato varieties increased vulnerability to blight. The lumper potato, widely cultivated for its high yield, lacked genetic diversity, making it susceptible to disease. Modern agricultural science has emphasized the risks of monoculture systems, and the Irish experience has often been cited in discussions of crop diversity and food security.
Economic structures further shaped outcomes.
Ireland in the 1840s was integrated into the British economy, with export-oriented agriculture operating alongside subsistence farming. Market mechanisms continued during the famine years, and food exports did not cease entirely. The presence of exports amid starvation became a subject of controversy. It reflected contractual obligations, property rights, and broader economic patterns rather than a simple absence of food.
Access, rather than absolute supply, was central to the crisis.
Religious and charitable organizations also played roles in relief. Quaker groups, for example, established soup kitchens and distributed aid, emphasizing impartial assistance. Catholic and Protestant institutions mobilized resources within their communities. International donations arrived from various countries, including contributions from individuals and civic groups. These efforts mitigated suffering in some areas but could not compensate for systemic challenges. By the early 1850s, the immediate crisis had subsided. Potato harvests improved, and mortality rates declined. Yet the Ireland that emerged was fundamentally altered. Population density had decreased. Patterns of landholding shifted. Emigration became embedded in social expectations, with departure viewed by many as a viable or necessary path. The famine's long-term legacy extends into modern discussions of governance, food policy, and social responsibility. It illustrates how environmental shocks can intersect with economic systems and political decisions to produce large-scale human consequences. It also underscores the importance